The Ocmulgee River marks a major continental watershed. It runs from the Piedmont Plateau to the Atlantic, but to its west, all waters flow into the Gulf of Mexico. In central Georgia, the river intersects a natural land route along the fall line. Here, the prehistoric mound builders erected the greatest ceremonial center in the southeast. Here, too, Macon was founded, an inland port town where riverboats met cotton wagons and the first railroad in the state. But when river traffic ceased a century ago, so too did development on the Ocmulgee between Macon and Hawkinsville 50 miles downstream. This economic retreat isolated the river and its flanking forests and swamps from the residential and recreational growth taking place along Georgia's waterways. In this Ocmulgee corridor, man's imprint was much reduced, leaving archaeological sites untouched and wildlife undisturbed. Mercer University has joined local and national efforts to preserve this special environment, providing academically rigorous studies of the Ocmulgee corridor's cultural and natural resources. This is the story of how an Ocmulgee Park and Preserve went from the dream of local civic leaders to national legislation, and how Mercer has helped make that dream a reality. It is the story of a special place, half forgotten by time in the modern world, where endangered plants and animals still flourish, and where thousands of years of human history in North America lie undisturbed. And all that can continue, if we protect them. The 116th Congress passed two bipartisan bills about the Ocmulgee River and its mounds, one sponsored by Representatives Austin Scott and Sanford Bishop, and another by Senators Johnny Isakson and David Perdue. Congress then included them in the 2019 authorization for the Department of the Interior. This act contained more than 100 changes to National Park Service properties. The section of the bill concerning Middle Georgia called for three things, as Ocmulgee Superintendent Jim David explains.
The bill had three parts to it, one of which, from that land study we did that we finished up in 2014, we drew what we felt our new boundary should be. And that was taking us from our current 702 acres to basically 3,000 acres. And so that bill gave us, established that new boundary. So now we have the authority to acquire the property within that boundary. And I had talked with all the landowners back around 2011, 2010, and asked them if they minded us including their property in this study, and they all said they had no issue. The second part of the bill was the name change. A lot of people in Macon wanted a straight national park, but when I was once again talking with my regional office and Washington, D.C. office, also back in 2010, 2012, they all said, well, at 3,000 acres, we think you're too small to be a straight national park.
Oh.
So we came up with a compromise. They said, how about if you became a national historical park? You still have the national in the park there with the identifier in the middle. And I said, okay, I can, that's fine. And then we also then changed the name to add the word mounds. So it's Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park. So the third part of the bill is to study the property along the Ocmulgee River between Macon and Hawkinsville,
Yes.
to see what, if there is perhaps natural and or cultural resources along that river that might justify a further expansion somewhere down the line. And admittedly, after that study comes back, if it does come back, and we know there are some very significant resources down along that river, so it's conceivable that if that study comes back positive, that this park could someday be a 40, 50,000 acre park.
As a full park.
As a full park, and then it would become Ocmulgee Mounds National Park and Preserve.
The Ocmulgee legislation became law when President Trump signed it on March the 12th, 2019. The Special Resources Study was then added to the Park Service's list of similar proposals, with an expected completion of 2 years. That would leave little time to gather the information needed to convince the Department of the Interior. But Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve Initiative, the local group that envisioned a large area in the river valley dedicated to wildlife, was well prepared. The initiative was led by the Mercer Law School graduate and environmental activist Brian Adams, and by Mercer Vice President Bill Solomon, whose family helped organize the 1933 coalition to make the ancient mounds a national monument. The initiative group attracted local citizens dedicated to preserving the environment and archaeological remains. They called for a nature preserve stretching 50 miles along the river from Macon and the Ocmulgee Mounds to Hawkinsville. The idea of a conservation area, where wildlife would be managed for hunting and fishing, had first been proposed in Macon soon after the Ocmulgee Monument was created. But World War II took precedence, and the dream passed away with that generation. In 2008, a PhD student at the University of Georgia, Chris Watson, completed his study of the middle reaches of the Ocmulgee River. He found that natural resources there had been largely undisturbed by modern development. He identified the rich potential of an Ocmulgee River corridor that combined river, swamp, and forest. Local environmentalists and outdoorsmen became interested, and this led to the Macon-based Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve Initiative. The National Parks Conservation Association ordered an economic study to test the plan's feasibility. Completed in 2017, it predicted that a park and preserve would not only improve life in Middle Georgia, but would attract visitors, bringing millions of dollars and many jobs to the area. As a sizable national park zone encompassing an area as large as 80,000 acres, it would become a major tourist destination. The economic study convinced political and civic leaders who encouraged cooperation among the various governmental authorities that controlled much of the riverside land south of Macon. Even private landowners saw the benefit of restricting future development in this large area of land and preserving it for the future. Mayor Robert Rickert of Macon comments on the plan's potential.
If it all works out, it would be a benefit not just to the community, but to the state and the nation. It has the potential for determining the assets that are located within this corridor along the Ocmulgee River between Macon and Hawkinsville. Be those artifacts from previous cultures and civilizations that have been here, or wildlife, or species of flora or fauna, as well as recreational opportunities for people that may want to take canoe trips or of different lengths. They don't want to spend a week on the river, but a couple of days, and where can I put in and where can I get out? So the resource at the river itself might be for recreation, but for preservation. If the study proves worthwhile, and we do have this park and preserve formally accepted by the United States Department of the Interior, it could preserve green space and treasured green space in the middle of a heavily populated area that would become increasingly valuable for the future.
The news from Washington led to jubilation in Macon. Ocmulgee Monument rejoiced in its new status, and properties were sought to fill in its new boundaries. James Floyd, principal chief of the Muskogee Creek Nation, was especially gratified to be present when essential elements of his people's heritage were to be preserved.
I hope that we all understand the historical significance here, and we always keep that near and dear to us, because when we come back, to us it's coming back home. When we look to the trees and the water, it's really in our blood. So to us, again, I just want to give thanks to each one of you, and especially to Jim and Mr. Vogel here, because they've really carried the torch on this for so long to make sure there's continuity in the movement of this effort to get to where we are today. We trusted so much into them. I just want to give them a big thank you, and to thank each one of you for being here today. I believe it opens up a new chapter in all of our histories, so that going forward, I know that we already have plans so that our own tribal members can be a part of the future here and conducting the study, that our youth can come down in the summers and be a part of looking at the plants and the animals in this area and helping to record them, so that future generations will know their work and they will know of their tie to this area and the significance of this area to each one of us in the past as well as the present. So again, my thanks to many of you.
In Washington, the Park Service started planning for an Ocmulgee special study. Without new scientific research, it could rely only upon the published data, which might not be enough to support a park and preserve. The initiative group had already acted to prevent that. 2 years earlier, they turned to Mercer for professional researchers to survey the historical and archaeological sites along the corridor. Mercer's senior research fellow, Eric Klingelhofer, was asked to serve as project director. A retired archaeologist and historian, Eric recognized how much a park and preserve could benefit Mercer's academic programs and the general public. He drew up a research design detailing goals, methods, and schedule, then assembled an advisory committee of scholars. As a research fellow for the one-year project, Dominic Day was well prepared, with a degree in anthropology and a master's in geographic information systems. Dominic would carry out field observations, analyze the results, and produce graphics illustrating the findings. Mercer would provide in-kind support to match the initiative's grant. The project began in April 2018. The river corridor passes through 5 counties: Bibb, Twiggs, Houston, Bleckley, and Pulaski. Dominic checked each entry on the county lists of sites in the Georgia Archaeological Record, located it, and then studied the entire group for spatial distribution, site type, and cultural period. The 5 counties contain more than 800 historic and prehistoric sites, and a significant portion of the latter are closely aligned to the river and its major tributaries. 63% of all known sites are within 1 mile from those waters. To find a standard of site importance that meets National Park Service requirements, the project used the National Register of Historic Places. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 authorized the creation of the register. Compiled by the National Park Service, it lists sites of cultural value worth preserving. The 5 counties had 5 sites already listed in the register, plus 45 that had been recommended by archaeologists, and another 6 the project deemed eligible. The combined total of 56 valuable sites is still an underestimation of the corridor's potential, because many sites are underexplored, and others have not yet been found. Site conditions needed to be checked as well. If a site had been destroyed by development, then it could not be nationally important. This called for visual inspections, and to do this where access was difficult or in swampy conditions, the project acquired a photographic drone. After the drone was tested at Fort Hawkins in Bibb County, it was used to record inaccessible sites. Overlooking the Ocmulgee River, Fort Hawkins is the most important historical site in the corridor. In 1806, President Jefferson built the fort to control the route pioneers used through Creek lands to the newly purchased Louisiana Territory. It was named for Benjamin Hawkins, Commissioner for Indian Affairs in the Southeast, who worked hard to preserve peace on the frontier. With a trading post for the Creek Nation, Fort Hawkins was garrisoned by U.S. Army troops and served General Andrew Jackson as regional headquarters and supply center in the War of 1812 and subsequent conflicts with Native Americans. After the frontier moved west, the garrison also moved, and in 1823 the city of Macon was founded on the far side of the river. Excavations at Fort Hawkins in the 1930s led to the reconstruction of one of its two corner blockhouses by the Daughters of the American Revolution. More recent digs discovered that remains of the fort had been buried beneath later school buildings, preserving hundreds of artifacts left by soldiers and settlers. The Fort Hawkins Commission, chaired by Judy Smith, is erecting new buildings there, including a smithy, and it plans to reconstruct the fort walls. Fort Hawkins was not the only fortification on the Ocmulgee. Soon after the War of 1812 broke out, General Blackshear's Georgia militia built a string of a dozen small forts to prevent raiding parties from attacking farms east of the river. The exact sites of the Blackshear-lined forts have not yet been located, but they would be protected in a park and preserve. Gateway to the other end of the river corridor is Hawkinsville in Pulaski County. Local librarian Joyce Ellison explained that its oldest house once stood across the Ocmulgee at the frontier settlement of Hartford. In 1836, the settlement moved to the higher, healthier South Bank and was renamed. As an abandoned town, archaeology could say much about life on the southern frontier when Native Americans could share the land with settlers, before the plantation system overtook them both. Editor of the Hawkinsville Dispatch and local historian, Chuck Sutherland, told how Hawkinsville had once been a busy river port.
Once you got to Hawkinsville, it got a little more treacherous getting to Macon. Macon was a pretty good port at one time, but the trains got there first and put Macon pretty much out of business. It wasn't worth it for them to go all the way to Macon because the trains were getting the business in, so Hawkinsville became a much more major port.
Below the bridge lies the ferry that it replaced, and upstream are the remains of the Charles Hartridge, a riverboat that blew up in 1856. As important as these sites are to the early history of the United States, the greatest cultural resources in the corridor are not historic, but prehistoric. All of human existence in North America can be found in the corridor, even the slight evidence of Ice Age hunters who face mastodons and other extinct giant mammals. The corridor contains 3 sites that archaeologists use as names of specific cultures or time periods notable throughout the entire Southeast: Swift Creek, Ocmulgee Plateau, and Lamar. These 3 encompass much of prehistory, but the most impressive must be the nearly 1,000-year-old earthen mounds related to the stone pyramids of Central America. The mound builders developed an intense agricultural system that fed urban communities. Only complex religious and political institutions could build those mounds without metal or modern tools. They created the first advanced civilization, labeled Mississippian because most of their towns were located along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. The settlement on the Ocmulgee Plateau was the farthest east that the culture spread. That, and the size and number of mounds, makes it the most important prehistoric mound site in the eastern coastal states. Other, later mounds in the corridor, some ceremonial, others residential, make this an exceptionally rich area of prehistory. Each year, the National Park Service hosts an Indian celebration at Ocmulgee Mounds, where performers and craft stalls are visited by thousands of Georgia residents. The Indians leading the celebration are the Muscogee Creek Nation, for whom the very ground of the park is sacred. Forcibly removed from Georgia nearly 200 years ago, the Muscogees do not forget ancestors in ancient homeland. Their history, before and after removal, is another of the cultural resources of national significance. Now the people of Middle Georgia welcome back the members of this tribe, not as visitors, but as partners in the land, in an Ocmulgee corridor. But the 20th century also witnessed dramatic changes in America, no place more so than the rural South. The Great Depression's unemployment and poverty and the New Deal programs to combat them, then the fight to end racial segregation, then the quest for women's equality. These important stories have their place in the corridor. Starting in 1933 and ending soon after Pearl Harbor, the archaeological excavations at Ocmulgee were the largest ever undertaken in the United States, employing as many as 800 workers. Other prehistoric sites in the river valley were excavated, and some of these teams were made of women, local black women, whose training and skill advanced our knowledge of the ancient peoples of the Southeast. White women also played a role in the Ocmulgee story. Isabel Patterson urged funding for archaeology in Georgia and pushed to have the federal government preserve the mounds. By studying the thousands of Ocmulgee artifacts, Carol Mason rewrote the history of the site and is recognized as the first professional female archaeologist in America. These little-known pioneers, of a different sort, labored to recover that very heritage that another generation hopes to preserve. We have seen how Mercer University joined the effort to safeguard the Ocmulgee River corridor, and how its archaeological survey identified cultural resources of national significance. The report and its findings will help the Department of the Interior in its decision about the future of the 50-mile stretch of river. But Mercer is not yet finished with the corridor. Soon it hopes to evaluate data on the rare and endangered species in the proposed park and preserve. Dwindling resident and migratory bird species especially need documentation, and Middle Georgians are aware of another kind of surviving population, unique in the state outside mountains or coastal swamps, the remnant Middle Georgia black bear, which coincidentally has given the university its team mascot. With Mercer's contribution to the Department of the Interior Special Study, and with strong public support, the Ocmulgee corridor, its wildlife and its past treasures, can be safe for all time and for all Americans.